In our lessons we've been looking at concerning characters of the Old Testament, it is with the purpose of trying to learn lessons from them. And so tonight we're looking at Moses, and of course, reminding ourselves that there is certainly worth our time to look at the Old Testament scriptures. There's much to be learned, and there's a reason that God has continued to preserve for us the record of the Old Testament, so that we, through patience and comfort of the scriptures, might have hope. The name Moses means drawn out of the water. And that, of course, is the story that we read about Moses in Exodus, the second chapter. It's there in that 10th verse that we see the meaning given to his name when it says that the child grew and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter and he became her son. And she called his name Moses and said, because I drew him out of the water. Moses wore many shoes in his lifetime. He was a commander, he was a judge, he was a prophet, he was an author, an historian, a teacher, an intercessor. He was all of those. And for the bulk of what we read in Exodus through uh, Numbers and Deuteronomy, we find that Moses is also mentioned 79 times in the New Testament. And without exception, when he is mentioned, he's presented as an example of faithfulness and an example of righteousness. In fact, twice in the book of Hebrews, it said in chapter 3, both verses 2 and 5, Moses was faithful in all of his house. And in the 11th chapter, at verse 38, the statement, which of course would be inclusive of Moses, was that he was of men of whom the world was not worthy. But yet, nevertheless, Moses did sin. And it is his sin that we want to study because I believe that it's here that we can find the lessons that we are certainly in need of as well. So, not or hating not to read any of the verses, I'd like for us to look at the 12 verses in Numbers chapter 20, beginning with verse 2. Uh, David, would you read us verses 2 and 3?
And there was no water for the congregation, so they gathered together against Moses and Aaron. The people contended with Moses and spoke, saying, if only we had died when our brethren died before the Lord.
All right, Bobby, 4 and 5.
Why have you brought up the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, that we and our animals should die here? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is not a place of grain, or figs, or vines, or pomegranates, nor is there any water to drink.
All right, Brother George, verses 6 and 7.
So Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the door of the tabernacle of meeting, and they fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying,
All right, Shane, verses 8 and 9.
Take the rod, you and your brother Aaron, gather the congregation together. Speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. Thus you shall bring water for them out of the rock, and give drink to the congregation and their animals. So Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he commanded him.
Okay, Autumn, verses 10 and 11.
And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, hear now, you rebels, must, must we bring water for you out of this rock? And Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation and the animals drank.
All right, verses 12 and 13. Clint.
And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe me, to hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel. Therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. this was the water of, I can't say that word.
Revival, I call it. That may not be the correct pronunciation.
Because the children of Israel contended with the Lord, and he was hallowed among them.
So here is what we want to focus on in our study, but just to give us a little bit of the overall life of Moses, I want to look at the three periods, just briefly, of Moses' life. And the interesting thing is that these three periods are each one in 40 years of length. The first period is from infant to adulthood. That would include his time in Pharaoh's house, and that we read in chapter 2, verses 1 through 15. And just some significant events, by no means every event that is possible to be mentioned. We have a different Pharaoh now that rules Egypt, not the same Pharaoh that ruled during the time of Joseph. And this Pharaoh fears the Israelites. They're increasing in number. So he puts them into slavery and hopes to diminish or at least maintain that number. But that did not work. He even went to the point of having all male children of the Israelites killed. And this, of course, is where we find Moses being introduced. That as an infant, his mother spares his life. And of course, we know his mother's name was Jochebed. And of course, Pharaoh's daughter ends up finding Moses, but giving Moses back to his mother. His mother raising him, and then, of course, the verse that we saw there in verse 10, where Pharaoh's daughter named Moses, we see that she adopts him as her son. He is referred to as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. That's the first 40 years of his life. Then he flees to Midian. This we read in verses 15 of chapter 2 all the way through chapter 4 and verse 19 of Exodus. And again, the significant events, but by no means all, at the age of 40, Moses, and on some of your papers, there's a little bit of a typo mess up, and I printed about 20 of the papers before I caught it. But at the age of 40, instead of makes, kills, and Egyptian, it should be that Moses kills an Egyptian who was punishing an Israelite. And he is rejected by the Israelites. And now, because of his killing the Egyptian, Pharaoh is threatening to kill Moses. So he escapes. He has to flee to Midian. And in Midian, he meets Jethro and marries one of Jethro's daughters, Zipporah. And to this marriage, he has two sons. And while with his father-in-law, he becomes a shepherd. And this is when God summons Moses and commissions Moses out of the burning bush to go and to lead the children of Israel out of captivity. So that's, at this point, Moses is 80 years of age. We see that now we're talking about the bringing of the children of Israel out of Egypt. That's what the word Exodus means, to escape or to leave Egypt. And that we read in chapter 4, verse 19 of Exodus, all the way through Deuteronomy chapter 34 and verse 7, where, of course, we see Moses dies. So he returns to Egypt. He meets with the elders of the children of Israel. He confronts Pharaoh with 10 plagues before it is that Pharaoh finally relents and lets the children of Israel go. And he leads Israel out of Egypt and brings them to Canaan. But because of the testimony of the spies, 10 of them not being good, favorable, then God causes them to wander for 40 years. The same number of period of time, it took 40 days for the spies to spy out the land, and now God has pronounced, because of their rebellion and unwillingness to enter the land of Canaan, now they will wander in the wilderness for 40 years for the specific purpose that all that generation of Israel would die. There would be none of that generation that came out of Egypt that would enter to the land of promise, with, of course, the exception of two individuals, Joshua and Caleb. So we see that Moses now dies at the age of 120. And the statement is made in Deuteronomy 34 and verse 7.
Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was not dim, nor his natural force abated.
And that truly is remarkable. His eyes not dim, nor his physical force is abated at the age of 120. So now getting back to what we read in Numbers chapter 20, let's look at the aspects of Moses' sin. For then it will help us to see the lessons that we can learn from all of this. First of all, Moses was angry. And this is quite obvious from the words that we read when it says, "Listen now, you rebels." That indicates there's a lot that we can understand that the tone of voice has to do with it. But sometimes the words themselves are enough to have us to understand that certainly Moses is speaking these words out of anger. In fact, when we look at the Psalm in 106, verses 32 and 33, Rodney, read those two verses.
They angered him also at the waters of strife, so that he went ill with Moses on account of them, because they rebelled against his spirit, so that he spoke rashly with his lips.
So they angered him. It did not go good with him. He spoke rashly with his lips. And generally, is that not the tendency of what happens when we are angry, if we're not careful? So Moses' sin grew out of his anger with the children of Israel. So how often do we tell our children, ask in a nice way? Well, if that rebellious generation of the children of Israel had asked in a nice way, then it probably wouldn't have went down as it did for Moses. But nevertheless, this does not excuse Moses. And let us also learn too, it doesn't excuse us. Just because someone says something in a certain way, that's no excuse for us to react in anger in the way that Moses did and do the things in what he says or fails to say that results from his anger. See, we need to learn to be slow to anger. James 1, verses 19 and 20, Brother Pat.
So then, my beloved, brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, for the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God.
Swift to hear. How many times have we heard that little phrase? Swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. And notice the rest of the verse, the next verse says, the wrath of man does not work the righteousness of God. And another verse, Ephesians 4, Jeremy, verse 26 and 27.
Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath, nor give place to the devil.
Be angry, but do not sin. It's not wrong to be angry. Jesus was angry. Remember when he went into the temple and saw the money changers and how that they were making the house of God a place then of thieves? Jesus was angry, but it was righteous anger, anger that didn't result because of something done against him. It was something that was being done against his Father. So Jesus wasn't striking out of anger because of some personal thing. But he had anger. And certainly he did not sin in what he did. Don't let the sun go down on your wrath, nor give place to the devil. And yet we have always said that the devil is an opportunist. He seeks for opportunities. And there's no better opportunity with any of us that the devil will have until those moments in which we're angry. That's when the devil will strike. That's when he will prance upon any of us. So Moses' sin, again, let's understand, was not his anger, not the fact that he got angry, but it was his acting that was sin. His acting that took place during his anger. The things that he said, and maybe even more in particular, the things that he didn't say. And that's the tendency we have in anger, is to say things we shouldn't be saying. But also, Moses had a problem that there were some things that he didn't say because of his anger. And we'll see those in just a moment. And too, often the disagreements that we have with our loved ones demonstrates the way that we act when we're angry. So one aspect of Moses' sin was anger. The other aspect was disobedience. See, Moses was told to speak to the rock. Verse 8, we read that. And he spoke many words, but he didn't speak unto the rock. He spoke many words, but he simply did not do what God told him to do. God said, speak to the rock. He did not do that. He spoke to the people. Hear now, you rebels. So see, he's addressing the people. And we see in all of this, as we will be, that he reaped the consequences. So disobedience was another aspect of Moses' sin. Another aspect, transgression. That word transgression means to just cross the line. It means to go beyond. I sometimes liken it to the word trespass. And we're familiar with what a sign on a building or a sign on a fence in a field that says no trespassing. We know what that means. Don't go beyond that point. Don't cross that fence. Don't go through that door. You're going to be trespassing. That's what transgression is, in a sense, to help us to understand. And see, it's in 2 John 9 that the King James Version says, whosoever transgresseth and abideth not in the doctrine of Christ hath not God. The American Standard Version says, whosoever goeth onward. So that's what we were saying a moment ago, to cross the line, to go beyond. And the American Standard Version bears that out. And the New American Standard Version says, anyone who goes too far, and it has a footnote that says, goes on ahead. So when we go on ahead of what God says to do, we are transgressing. And that's what Moses did. God told Moses, speak to the rock. Moses went beyond that. He did not speak to the rock, which was his disobedience. But we see his transgression because he went beyond. He spoke to the people. He never addressed the rock with his voice, which is what he was supposed to have done. So Moses sinned in the sight of God by going too far. Another sin, another aspect of Moses' sin is that he dishonored God. And we saw that when we read verses 10 and verse 12 in Numbers chapter 20. Notice Moses said, "Must we bring forth water for you?" And there's no mistaking about who that we refers to. That we refers to him and Aaron. Must we? They were the ones that were told to gather the people together before the door of the tabernacle. Summons the people together. So they're together. And now Moses is saying, "Must we fetch you water or bring forth water for you?" So this we leaves out the one who is really responsible for all of this. The bringing forth of the water, was that something Moses did? No. Was that something Aaron did? No. It's what God did. But see, in these statements, there's no mentioning of God. Hear now, you rebels, must we fetch you water? Bring forth water out of this rock? So God is left out of what's taking place here at this point. And as the psalmist said, that we read a moment ago, he, referring to Moses, spake rashly with his lips. That was the New King James Version. The King James says Moses spake unadvisedly with his lips. So that's what anger can do. It can rush us into doing and into saying things that we would not otherwise do if we could be angry and keep our anger in check, under control. Be angry and sin not. Verse 12 shows that they failed to hallow God in the eyes of the people. Read Deuteronomy 32, verses 48 through 52 for us, Brother Matthews.
Then the Lord spoke to Moses that very same day, saying, "Go up this mountain of the Abram, Mount Nebo, which is in the land of Moab, across from Jericho, view the land of Canaan, which I give to the children of Israel as a possession, and die on the mountain which you have seen, and be gathered to your people, just as Aaron, your brother, died on Mount Hor, and was gathered to his people, because you trespassed against me among the children of Israel at the waters of Meribah Kadesh, in the wilderness of Zin, because you did not hallow me in the midst of the children of Israel. Yet you shall see the land before you, though you shall not go there, into the land which I am giving to the children of Israel."
All right, where we started reading here in verse 48, then the Lord spoke to Moses that very same day. Don't understand this one thing. This is a different time, a different period from Numbers chapter 20. It was sometimes later on down in time that we are seeing the statements that are being made here in Deuteronomy chapter 32. And this is what he tells. He reminds, at this point, Aaron is dead. But he reminds Moses of what occurred. He reminded him of what took place back there in Numbers chapter 20. And it's just like we saw there in verse 12 of Numbers 20. The statement is clearly made again by God in verse 52. Verse 51. You did not hallow me in the midst of the children of Israel. With that statement that Moses made, must we fetch you or bring forth water from this rock? That did not hallow God. That did not bring the attention, the respect, the honor, the glory to God that it needed to. So that's why we have it mentioned in Numbers 20 and verse 12, and that's why we have it mentioned here again at the time here in Deuteronomy chapter 32, near the end of Moses' life. You did not hallow me in the midst of the children of Israel. So they did not give God his just due. He was the one that provided the water, not Moses and Aaron. It was God. Time is running out, but you probably remember another instance of where an individual did not glorify God, and he was eaten with worms. Remember Herod that beheaded James in Acts chapter 12? All of the glorying that Herod did, and yet his days were pretty quickly ended. But certainly, the dishonoring of God will have its consequences. And then another aspect is unbelief, and this is plainly stated in verse 12. God said, because you did not believe me. Think about it. That's a remarkable statement to say to somebody like Moses, of all people. Because you did not believe me? See, faith in God is more than just believing there is a God. Faith in God is more than just acknowledging his existence. Moses would have not acknowledged the existence of God. There's no doubt in Moses' mind that God is real, that God exists. But because of this sin and all of the aspects of this sin, God said, and rightfully so, to one of the greatest men that ever lived in the Old Testament, because you believed me not. So true belief, true faith in God is trusting in God. It's relying on God, and it's relying on what God says. And that's how Moses did not believe God, because he did not rely upon what God said. Did he not hear what God said? I'm confident that he heard. He just did not do what God said. Moses did not show or demonstrate on this instance, in this occasion, his faith in God. He became angry. God requires that we control our anger. He was disobedient. Well, faith is proved and faith is perfected in obedience. You know, godly men and women prove their faith in Hebrews 11. How? By their obedience. Every single incident, every single individual in Hebrews 11, yes, it was by faith. It was by faith. It was by faith, but by faith what? It was by faith that they did what they did. He was guilty of transgression, and definitely what God has said was not as good as what he had not said. We know what he said, but it should have been what he not, that he didn't say. He dishonored God, and we need to acknowledge and we need to praise God at all times and in all things. So what are the lessons that we can learn from Moses' sin? But one lesson I believe we can learn is that we can sin in the way that's least expected. Moses was meek and humble. Moses was not harsh. Moses was not an ill-tempered man. How many of us could have put up with the constant moaning and groaning that the children of Israel did all through those years? I couldn't. I couldn't. But Moses did, except on this one occasion. Numbers 12, verses 1, 2, and 3. Oh, it is just verse 3. Philip?
Now, the man Moses was very humble, more than all men who were on the face of the earth.
Moses was humble. Who else was humble? The Lord? What did Jesus say? For I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest for your soul. Jesus was meek. Moses was meek. In his day, there was not a more meeker man than Moses. And meekness is not weakness. I think that's so often what meaning that we put on the word meek. Can't be. Meekness is not weakness. Meekness is moral courage. That's what meekness is. And in Exodus chapter 3, verse 11, Jay?
But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?
See, he's meek. Who am I that I should go to the children of Israel? But yet, nevertheless, his character was not demonstrated at the waters of Meribah. Look at Peter's denial. He never would have thought. Peter never would have thought, and what he would have done. He never would have thought what he did. And yet, he said he would. And all of the disciples there in Matthew 26:35. Where we think we're the strongest may be the place that Satan attacks. And which of us are not familiar with 1 Corinthians 10:12, 13?
Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed, lest he fall.
So we see no one is above sin. No one is immune to sin. That's another lesson. Again, look at the man that we're studying. I'm calling him the greatest man. You may disagree with that. But I'm talking about the greatest man in the Old Testament. And yet, he was not immune to sin. And we know he was one of the greats of the Bible. Time's running out. Deuteronomy 34, verses 10 through 12. There is not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses. But yet, nevertheless, Moses sinned. The lesson? No one is immune to sin. Not Moses, not gospel preachers, not elders. No one is immune to sin. And if we say that we have no sin, we make God a liar. Patrick, 1 John 1, verse 8.
If we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us.
All right. Another lesson we can learn. God expects exact obedience. And we need to worship exactly as the truth directs. But back up one. John 4, verse 24.
God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth.
And we know that following a false way is going to condemn us. In Proverbs 16:25, Jay?
There's a way that seemeth right to a man, but its end is the way of death.
And what did Jesus say in Matthew 15:9? In vain they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. So God expects exact obedience. And another lesson, the end doesn't justify the means. See, what I'm saying is Israel was famished, they was weak, and when Moses brought forth water, they were refreshed. Their problem was over with. So no doubt that stubborn and that rebellious generation would have said to God, what difference does it make? Strike the rock or speak to it. See? The important thing is we got what we wanted. We got water. And people today say, our missionary societies, our sponsoring church arrangements, they've done so much good. People have obeyed the gospel because of them. Or our social programs, they're bringing in many people. Look at the good that we're doing. We're drawing lots of people to services. Or don't criticize women preachers. Look at the good that they're doing and the appeal they have in reaching other women with the gospel. Can't you see that God is blessing their preaching? See, the end justifies the means. It's all of these arguments are making, but the end does not justify the means. Moses accomplished good, yes, but the way that he went about it was wrong. In Romans 3 and verse 8, why not say, let us do evil that good may come, as we've been slanderously reported, and some affirm that we say. God judges us by our actions. He judges us on the basis of what we do. Today, people want to be judged by some kind of subjective faith, a mental acknowledgement, or some feeling that they have. But James tells us that faith without works won't manage it. God will bring every work into judgment. God is no respecter of person. That's another lesson we can learn. Moses sinned, he was punished by not being allowed to enter the promised land. He was forgiven, but he had to suffer the consequences. And another lesson is God is to be hallowed and praised. And another lesson we see from Moses is we cannot let mistakes, we cannot let sins defeat us. Moses made a grave error, but he did not let it defeat him. He didn't give up, nor did he turn from God because of his error. So he was a great man, but he sinned. Sin causes us to fall short of the glory of God. And if the great man Moses were not excused from his sins, neither will we. God is no respecter of person. So let us do our best on relying on the Lord. Let us not give up. Let us not give in. And let us not give out in our striving to be a Christian. Lord willing, next week we look at Moses' successor and what a great big pair of shoes Joshua has to fill. Sorry we ran over time. But thank you so much for your time, for your attention. And hopefully you'll have these outlines to look at some of the things that we had to go over rather quickly. So apologize for that.